Welcome one and all to another new episode of Engage, where learning through play is the name of the game. I sincerely hope that you and yours are staying healthy and safe. Now, when it comes to leveraging the power of games for learning, the ideal that we strive for is to create a situation in which whatever the player is doing in the game mirrors what we want to help them learn in real life as closely as humanly possible. And today, our very special guest, Dr. Ariel Marcy, is here to talk about how Steam Galaxy Studios is striving to accomplish exactly that for the field of evolutionary biology.
Well, hello, my name's Ariel Marcy. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I was teaching at Stanford. There were a number of moments when I was trying to teach where I just felt like drawing things on the board just wasn't really working. I was already kind of interested in game design, and it seemed like the perfect solution to this problem that I had. And so this game was actually designed for undergrads to help them in exploring an evolutionary tree, which is one of the most important diagrams in science because it basically tells us all of this insane diversity that we see living today, walking the earth, growing around us. All of that at one point came from a single cell. And that's just fantastic. And I think that's a wonderful way to understand a lot of science, but it's also just a wonderful way to feel connected.
So many great games evolve from the classics, and Go Extinct is no exception. Now, mechanically speaking, the roots of this game can be traced all the way back to good old Go Fish, which of course can be played anywhere a deck of ordinary playing cards is handy. If you didn't grow up playing Go Fish, or maybe you just haven't played that game in forever, the goal of that game is pretty simple. Be the player with the most complete four-of-a-kind sets by the end of the game. Each player starts out with a certain number of cards depending on how many people are playing. The leftovers are then set in a draw pile within everyone's reach, and the game begins with the youngest player. And on your turn, you get to ask one other player if they have the type of card that you're looking for. So for instance, you might say, "Hey, do you have any threes?" And if what they gave you completes a four-of-a-kind of what you were looking for, you get to plop that down and go again. But if your opponent didn't have what you were looking for, they'll say, "Go Fish," and you'll have one chance to draw what you were hoping for from the draw pile. And if you get lucky and you got what you needed to complete that set, you can go ahead and plop it down and have another turn. And of course, if you didn't get lucky, then that's it. Your turn is done, and you move on to the next player. Now, as it says right in the rule book, Go Extinct is not Go Fish that you might have learned in kindergarten. No. In this game, your goal is not simply to get the most four-of-a-kind sets, but rather to track down the most complete sets of closely related animal species, much like this one. Hold up, pump the brakes for just a second. How am I supposed to know what kind of cards to ask for in this game when it's my turn? I know the numbers in an ordinary deck of playing cards will count up from 2 to 10, and then of course there's a jack, queen, king, and an ace, but what about in this game? Well, that's where we turn to the board that came with this game for the big picture, because here we have a complete evolutionary tree to consult for reference, and here comes the other really clever twist with this game. We're not just looking at this diagram so we know what the other cards are in the deck or what the other players might start off with in their hands. No, our real goal here is to understand how all these animals are related to one another. And the core mechanic of Go Extinct emulates this process that a real-life evolutionary biologist would put to the test in order to interpret and understand these relationships by allowing the player to ask their opponent not just for one specific type of animal, much like in Go Fish where you'd say, "Do you have any threes?" You get to ask your opponent if they have any animals that belong to an entire evolutionary clade. For example, let's say I was looking to complete a set starting with my friend, the lion here. I could ask my opponent if they have a specific animal like the spotted bat, which they are closely related to. Or I could trace back in the evolutionary tree and ask my opponent if they have any Lower Asia Therians, which go by the nickname Northsiders in this game. Or I could go a little further back and ask my opponent if they have any placentals, which go by the nickname Big Babies. Or I could even go even further back, and you get the idea. And if my opponent has an animal that fits into the category of what I've requested, they must give me at least one card that complies with my request. And I get to keep going until I make a request that's unsuccessful, to which my opponent then gets to cheer, and I have to draw a card from the draw pile. Anytime I've discovered a completed clade, I may go ahead and play those cards on the table for my fellow scientists seated around me to peer review, shall we say. And then I'm going to draw from the draw pile until I replenish my hand fully to be 6 cards. And as I'm doing this, if I discover any additional clades that I can have my fellow scientists peer review, I'll go ahead and do that. Otherwise, if I'm not that lucky, play will continue on with the next player. Now, once the draw pile itself goes extinct, whenever a player makes a successful request, their opponent has to relinquish 3 cards that comply with that request. So this further incentivizes players to search for those relationships by clade as opposed to asking for individual animals. Now, Go Extinct does not immediately end once one player seated around the table lays down the last clade that they could possibly complete, but rather once everybody has run out of cards to play. Strategy-wise, you'll find it may not be the best to be that player who finishes first, because looking at that evolutionary tree, you'll find that not all the clades are created equal. In fact, the larger clades will net you more points for end-of-game scoring, and as you might expect, the player with the most points by the end of the game wins. So where did the inspiration for the core mechanic of Go Extinct come from?
I think the biggest key insight was realizing that an evolutionary tree, which is kind of this branching structure, another way to think about it is it's just sets within sets. So humans are great apes, we're also primates, we're also mammals, we're also vertebrates. Like all of these are sets that just get more and more inclusive. So they include more and more animals in addition to us. And that is a fantastic structure for a game because it builds in this very interesting dynamic. When you're asking for something like great apes, you can only mean a few animals. But if you're asking for something like mammals, then you mean a lot more animals. This like really juicy tension between how specific do you ask versus how mysterious do you be by asking for something more inclusive. And that's almost exactly the same thought process that scientists use to think about the tree. They're kind of navigating through these sets, inferring characteristics about new animals that they don't know much about based on what sets they're included within. And that basically means that the game kind of scaffolds this very expert-like way of thinking about the tree. I think that's what games do really well, is that they get students or players to really immerse themselves in more of the systems of scientific thinking. It allows them to test different ways of doing that and then get immediate feedback from their peers. That's kind of how I approach games about science, is thinking about, okay, well, what do I actually like thinking about in that scientific framework? Not the facts, but how do I actually like thinking? And it's that sets within sets structure that really nailed it for Go Extinct.
That's fascinating. So what you're saying is that what you're doing in this game is an authentic task that biologists would actually be doing?
Absolutely. And that was actually my cognitive dissonance when I was teaching. I was like, I look at an evolutionary tree and it's like a Rosetta Stone. Like you're like, oh, what does that mean? I don't know that animal yet, but it's a mammal, so I know all these things about it, and that makes me really interested to ask questions about why it's different. Like this is the kind of stuff that you go to a scientific conference, they're going to throw an evolutionary tree up for you just to give you context. For us, it's like Rosetta Stones, but when I was trying to teach it in class, they seemed like alien artifacts, and so I was trying to bridge that divide a bit.
I know you also published a follow-up to Go Extinct called Go Extinct, Stardust Captures the Carnivores. What can you tell us about this version of the game?
The original game was one of the first games that I made, focuses on vertebrate evolution, whereas this one just really focuses in on the specific mammals that are carnivores. The Stardust version reflects a little bit of my growth as a game designer by including a few additional cards that encourage player interaction. So there's a honey badger card. Just from a game design perspective, it helps that middle game that can get a little bit repetitive once you've learned your strategy and you're kind of working towards a goal. It can kind of mix up that experience just a little bit.
Oh, cool. And do you plan to keep expanding throughout the evolutionary tree?
Yeah, we're going to monopoly it. So I'm actually prototyping another version of the game that's focused on Australian megafauna. This game's really exciting because it's working with the Center for Biodiversity and Heritage. So it's connected to both recently extinct animals as well as archaeology and currently living animals. And so it's kind of that time frame. Some information we only know because of the indigenous knowledge that's conveyed through stories as well as through rock art and petroglyphs and even the names themselves. So it's really cool to explore that biology as well as the history of humans as natural historians on the Australian continent. I ran a Kickstarter for the original Go Extinct, and I have to say Kickstarters are so much work, but they're worth it in more ways than just getting a project realized, because you're connected to this really vibrant community of creative people. You often get connected to people who are running similar campaigns to you. I was the science consultant on this book, which focuses on evolution. That was super fun. Because we had such a great time with that book, we decided that it would be really fun to make a Stardust version of Go Extinct that focused on a lot of the animals that they use in their examples. And they have a lot of really charismatic carnivores. The trait that all carnivores share is a tooth called the carnassial. So it's not the canine, not the pointy one, it's the carnassial in the back. It looks a little bit like a scary knife if you see a lion beyond. It's like that scary tooth. So that's the tooth that's really effective at shearing meat, and is what makes carnivores just really, really good at what they do. And so almost every single carnivore, from hyenas to weasels to cats to dogs to bears, all of them have this tooth just because it's so good at what it does.
So even we as humans have this carnassial tooth too?
We have the same, so it's a molar and a premolar, but it's not a carnassial in us because it's a specific kind of shape that makes it the carnassial.
Do you plan on making any other sort of game-based learning experience that gets deeper into the weeds in terms of exploring connections with specific evolutionary traits?
Yeah, so actually the game that I'm prototyping at the moment, I prepared this earlier. It's a game called Duo, and it encourages you to find convergent traits between mammals and birds.
Ooh, now that sounds really intriguing, but I'm afraid we're going to have to hit the pause button on that for now and save the discussion on that game for part 2 of our very special look at Steam Galaxy Studios. But in the meantime, if you've enjoyed this educational program, smash that subscribe button, and please consider backing production of the show at patreon.com/engageshow. We really appreciate all of your support. And speaking of support, don't underestimate the monumental impact you can have on helping this show to grow and reach a wider audience simply by sharing it around with anyone you know who is interested in leveraging the power of games for learning in authentic, unorganic, and practical ways. I've been Jeremy, and this has been Engage, where learning through play is the name of the game. Thanks for watching.